Hey dudes and dudettes, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is another edition of The Radical Reset. Before I get started today on today's subject, which is Trump's greatest accomplishment, and no, I'm not being facetious, I'd like to remind you, just from the beginning, click on the subscribe button, click on the notification button, and share this with your friends so we can spread the word of anti-politism. Now, also above my head, by the way, if you want to get involved and get into the roots and the growth of what is a nascent movement that will become more and more important as we pass this election and get into the coming COVID depression, then text anti-politism above to the 844-935-044 number above my head. Did I say 044? 0444. I'm not Joe Biden, I'm not demented, and I'm here. But in the meantime, let's talk about what's going on right now. Now, I'm going to put the election exhausts me. Let's talk about presidents. One of the ways that I rate presidents is lasting accomplishments. What do they do in office? You know, they're all transitory figures, whether it's 4 years or 8 years, or in the case of Gerald Ford, 2.5 years, or whatever it might be. They come and they go. You know, 8 years, even if they serve 2 terms, is not a very long time in the span of history. And I know we're all very freaked out, and we all make, we being political activists on the right or the left, make all these draconian predictions of what's going to happen. I'm obviously predicting a depression, which I don't think is necessarily draconian, but inevitable. But I digress. The point is, in the end, it's all going to work. It's all going to work itself out one way or the other, for better or for worse. So what I'm not going to do today is dwell on the passing issues of this current election. As I'm taping this, they did the debate last night, which was the second debate. It was a better debate, but fuck it. I'm tired of talking about it. You know, it all comes down to this. I can't believe out of 340 million people, these are the 2 best we can come up with. Anyway. But Trump has accomplished a very meaningful thing. Now I want to first, before I get into his most meaningful accomplishment, I want to set the stage on how I rate the presidents of my lifetime, and I rate them all by what they did that had a lasting positive effect. So, for example, I think probably the greatest president of my lifetime, based on the sheer amount of legislation that he got through Congress, was without a doubt Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. But everything he did, although well-meaning, I'm sure, was highly destructive. The destruction of the black nuclear family in particular, and the nuclear family broader in society brought on by programs like AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children and Welfare, has been devastating. All of his programs have been redistributionist and devastating. You cannot enrich somebody else by stealing from somebody who's productive. You can't make the unproductive productive through the enforced theft, which is what taxation is. It's the ultimate form of socialism and redistribution of wealth. But I don't want to get caught in that either. Now, it's interesting. Presidents who I thought during the time when I was, observing them active in office, and I'll give you an example, Jimmy Carter, who I thought at the time was a terrible president. As it turns out, he had 3 lasting accomplishments that today have an incredibly positive effect on all of our lives, whether you realize it or not. And those 3 things are: 1, the Camp David peace accords, which against all odds, and the assassination of Anwar al-Sadat, and and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and everything else has managed to somehow endure to this day. And without Egypt, there's never going to be a coordinated Arab war against Israel, because they would have no chance of success without the largest Arab country. So we've all benefited from it, in the sense that while we've had plenty of casualties in dealing with the Middle East, it would have been so much worse without the Camp David Accords. And that is largely the product of the efforts of Jimmy Carter, along with Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and I'd like to say Arafat, but no, just too corrupt for words. But anyway, it's lasted to this day. The second thing that Jimmy Carter did that people never give him credit for is he broke up the airlines. He broke up the monopoly of the airlines. It used to be, when I was a kid and until the 1970s, the air travel was unbelievably expensive relative to people's average incomes. But by deregulating the airlines and opening up the skies to not having to go through the federal government to get routes before they could go to cities, and getting rid of the political influence of airlines like Pan Am, which doesn't even exist anymore, or Eastern, which is gone, or Continental, which is destroyed, or TWA, which is gone. He unleashed the destructive process of capitalism, which resulted in better choices and better airlines, like Southwest, like JetBlue, okay, for example, and, you know, the discount carriers like Frontier and the rest. So having said that, that's all a product of Jimmy Carter, and the fact that you can fly, for example, from Phoenix, where I live, to Hawaii today for less than $300 is a product of the deregulation of the airlines by Jimmy Carter. And I don't want to get into what COVID's done to the airline industry. This too shall pass. They too shall recover. This will all be a memory, and we can thank cheap tickets. We can thank Jimmy Carter for cheap tickets. And the third thing he did, and I think monumental thing that has lasted the test of time and makes my assessment of him a reassessment, given, you know, the benefit of 2020 hindsight, is the breakup of AT&T. He broke up AT&T. For example, Verizon, who's the nation's number one cellular carrier, was just part of AT&T when it was broken up, as is, for example, T-Mobile, just as one more example. Anyway, by breaking up the telephone company, by introducing competition, it's why today I carry, for example, a Samsung cellular phone with an unlimited data talk and text plan, and I pay $40 a month. And, you know, in the old days, you didn't buy the phone, you rented the phone from the phone company, and long distance was brutally expensive. And I know this is no memory for any of you millennials and younger, but believe me, you can thank Jimmy Carter for all that. So the point I'm making is not to do a Carter presidency redux, but to point out that his accomplishments, those three things have stood the test of time. Here we are, you know, 45 years later, and Carter's accomplishments, these three things are still around. Now, the same is true, for example, of his successor, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was, his number one accomplishment, something that we benefit from today, is the destruction of the Soviet Union. While the fall of communism came under the presidency of George H.W. Bush, Bush 1, in fact, it was Ronald Reagan. It was an intentional plan to bring them to their knees that worked. And as a result, we have, for example, Bill Clinton was able to balance the budget, and he didn't balance the budget by any clever legislation. He balanced the budget because with the Cold War over, we had enormous, at the time, military savings, which allowed him in the 1990s to do something that hasn't been done since, which is balance the budget. That's a product of Ronald Reagan. That's his greatest accomplishment, the winning of the Cold War. George H.W. Bush, nothing lasting. In fact, he made a mess out of the goddamn Middle East, to be honest. He just meddled, made a mess of it. Bill Clinton was an effective caretaker president, but again, name something he did that's lasting. I mean, you know, when you look back at the test of time, he'll never be on Mount Rushmore. And in my opinion, no president should be on Mount Rushmore, because we shouldn't deify presidents. That's just ridiculous. This is a Republican democracy. We should never deify our presidents. Mount Rushmore should be dynamited, in my opinion, because we shouldn't be celebrating, you know, as if these guys shit marble. And when you compare the myth of someone like Abraham Lincoln to, you know, someone like Barack Obama, you know, it's like a night and day contrast, but not really, because Lincoln was actually a giant shit dog. I mean, just to give you one example, Lincoln was, if Lincoln had not been assassinated, there wouldn't be too many black people left in the United States, because he was obsessed with the idea, and you can look this up, do your own research. He was obsessed with the idea of putting black people back on a boat and sending them back to Liberia. In fact, just in the week before his assassination, he had called three black leaders into his office, including Frederick Douglass, and asked them to do the right thing and to tell their people to follow them to the boats, basically. And he was trying to line up the ships. Now, they smartly told him in a very nice way, no fucking way, Mr. President, and of course a week later he was a dead body. But don't deify Abraham Lincoln. I mean, we've got him to the point where the guy shit marble. In fact, if you really think about it, just to digress a little bit more in this podcast, it was completely unnecessary to fight the Civil War. I know that, look at it this way. Slavery is nothing new, okay? It's been around mankind since before the Bible was written. It's all through the Bible. It's all through every culture. Slavery is nothing new. Yet somehow, the two largest slavers into the New World, where we live, what was called the New World at the time because it was new to the world at that time, there were approximately 10.5 million slaves imported from Africa. And when I say the New World, that includes the entire Western Hemisphere. So it includes the Caribbean primarily, and, you know, the United States. Of those 10.5 million, less than 500,000 actually came to the mainland of the United States. The importation of slaves ended early on, quite frankly. Most of the slaves in the United States came as a result of families having children that into slavery from that point forward. So today's descendants of slaves are all descendants of the original 400,000 and change that were imported from Africa. Where did the other 10 million go? They went to the Caribbean islands as slaves of the English and the Spaniards. And both the English and the Spaniards managed to end slavery without a civil war. In fact, slavery was ending worldwide. Ultimately, it would have ended in the South as well. It was the march of history. Slavery was well on its way out by the time Abraham Lincoln became president. And he was no lover of black people. And in fact, it was unnecessary to fight the Civil War because slavery, the other 10 million imported slaves and all their descendants who live in places like Jamaica and Haiti and the Bahamas and, I'm not going to list every island in the Caribbean, all of those descendants of slaves were all freed without firing a shot. So what made our Civil War necessary? It had nothing to do with slavery. It was the breakup of the Union, where this man suspended habeas corpus, in other words, your legal rights to be innocent until proven guilty, jailed tens of thousands of political prisoners, and really emancipated nobody. The Emancipation Proclamation, just to give you another example, was an emancipation of slaves in the North, and there were no slaves in the North, and the South, as a rebel state, was not going to be bound by a proclamation by the President of the United States. So, not that he wasn't, a genius in many ways, but he was, in some ways, an evil genius. And it's important not to deify presidents, but I way digressed on that. Let's come back to what I was talking about in my lifetime in presidents and contributions that last, okay? Because we're going to talk about, ultimately here, Donald Trump's contribution that's going to be the one that lasts. And I'm not talking about Supreme Court justices. Yes, that's going to last too, but Supreme Court picks are notoriously fickle. George H.W. Bush picked David Souter thinking he was going to be a conservative, and he turned out to be a liberal, and that's just one example of many. Nixon's Earl Warren Court, same thing. I mean, justices are going to do what justices are going to do, and they're not going to answer questions for the Senate ahead of time of how they're going to rule. And when they're actually in there, they do what they want. And so it has nothing, who knows what the legacy of the Supreme Court is going to be. But the one thing and Barack Obama spent 8 years in the Oval Office to accomplish absolutely nothing. Now, I understand that he left the office more popular than when he came in. But here's the thing, ladies and germs. Go ahead, name something that's lasted. Obamacare is gutted. It's a shell of itself, and everything else was just a bunch of executive orders because he couldn't work with Congress. And when you do that, when you rule by executive order, then they're going to be overturned by your successor by executive order, which Donald Trump has largely done. So Barack Obama's presidency was 8 years of literally nothing, a shitty recovery, and no major accomplishments, no foreign policy. In fact, if anything, he created ISIS and by bugging out of the Middle East and conducting his foreign policy like, frankly, an idiot. Now, having said that, and by the way, I'm in favor as an anti-politist of creating America as a giant Switzerland. I wouldn't be involved in the Middle East if I were the President of the United States, but I'm not, so let's not get into that. So let's get into Donald Trump's greatest accomplishment, the one that's going to last hopefully forever, and that is the acceptance of Arab countries of Israel. Now, this is getting no play in the mainstream press these days, and it's getting no play because it's such a huge accomplishment. If this had been done by Obama, if Obama had somehow done this, which in a minute I'll explain why that was never going to happen, he would go down as one of the press would have trumpeted this as the greatest accomplishment in the last 100 years. But the fact that it's Donald Trump, of course, it doesn't get press at all. But the fact that the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and now the Sudan, this morning as I'm speaking to you, and what brought this into my mind was Sudan is also about to normalize relations with Israel. Soon to follow others is an enormous testament to the truth of why Donald Trump was right and all the experts were wrong, and he deserves an enormous amount of credit along with his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who I know gets no positive anything these days, but I'm going to be positive about it. Now, here's the thing. The Arabs have had it with the Palestinians. Even this morning, as I was watching the news this morning, I watched Marie Harf, who's a Democratic strategist on Fox, talk about how the Palestinians were shut out once again, and this is no great big deal, the Sudan joining, yada, yada, yada. The left is obsessed with the Palestinians. Look, As Abba Eban, who was the original foreign minister of Israel, once said, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They have had, from Jimmy Carter on, an opportunity to have a Palestinian state. They have said no to it again and again and again. Why have they said no to it? Because their leadership is so corrupt and have lined their own pockets with so many billions of dollars. Arafat's family, he's been dead for over a decade, his family are billionaires, okay? The money, the Palestinians the Palestinian leadership made a cottage industry out of extorting money from other Arab powers who found them a convenient foil. In other words, in order to maintain their dictatorships, it was convenient to make the Jews the villain and the Palestinians the victim, and pump money through them, and it was convenient to maintain their own power base at home on the so-called Arab street. But a younger generation has taken over, just like the millennials here, the millennials there have taken over, and they've had the Arab Spring, and the people are fucking tired of paying money to a corrupt Palestinian leadership who doesn't seem to understand that they're not going to get everything. Any more than the Cubans in Miami are going to go back to Havana, reclaim all their property now that Castro's dead, and retake over the island as the oligarchy that was before under Batista. That's not going to happen. And the Palestinians are not going to get the pre-67 borders with Israel. Those were indefensible borders. It's not going to happen. And finally, Arabs with a brain, and there are lots of Arabs they're fine people. The Arabs and the Jews, by the way, just as an aside, and I'm a Jew, just to share with you, we're cousins. We're cousins fighting each other. There are more similarities in many ways between Judaism and Islam. I'll just use one example. The kosher laws and halal are pretty much the same thing. We celebrate Sabbath on the same day. We do not see Jesus Christ as the savior of mankind. There are a lot of similarities between Islam and Judaism, although we are substantially less violent and won't blow up our own children, but I digress. Having said all of those things, it is cousins fighting each other. And finally, a bunch of younger cousins have figured out this is stupid. Israel has what the Arabs need. They have two things that the Arab powers need that Donald Trump recognized. The first is they have by far the most successful economy in the Middle East, and enormous amounts of expertise. So many things that we use every day are really a product of Israel. Okay, the United States patents more things than any other country in the world, but the number 2 country in the world for patents every single year, in other words, new inventions, new technologies, new ways to make life better, is Israel. And Israel has a population of 12 million people versus the United States with 340 million people. It's a very dynamic culture, and it has a lot of ideas, and it has a very creative, group of people. Not to play too much on a Jewish stereotype, but Jews are smart and do invent a lot of cool things. And throughout history, this is nothing new about Jews and Judaism. And the Arabs would like to get a piece of that action, and who can blame them? Now, the Arabs have something the Israelis need, which is capital and a huge market, a bunch of new customers. And there is a huge hunger on the street in the Arab world for a better life for their families, because in the end, they're just people. Muslim or Christian, they're just people. And Israel, with their technology and know-how and business acumen, together with Arab financing and customers, the billion Arabs, is a much bigger market than 12 million Jews, right? So obviously, it's a win-win for both sides. And Israel has another thing besides the economic participation. And by the way, the Arabs are also recognized, and the Saudis in particular recognize, in Bahrain and UAE, and Sudan, that oil is going out. I mean, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, oil over time is going to dwindle to nothing, or let's say a shadow of its former. I don't know if it'll ever go to nothing in our lifetimes, but certainly a shadow of its former self. So you can't bank on that if you want to have a successful economy. And without a successful economy, a government will fall. Understand that any government, and this is not I'm sorry to shake that. This is not a digression. Just understand that government means a group of people. That's all a government is. And it's a small group of people relative to the population of any country. So a government of a country like Saudi Arabia might have a couple of thousand people participating, but it's a country with millions of people. And if they become disgruntled, the government will go out. That's true in any country. No dictator can survive an unhappy mass. Ask Nicholas Ceausescu in Romania. The toughest dictators go down when their mass becomes, when their population becomes very unhappy. And the Arabs, particularly Sunni Arabs, see this. And the one thing they're most afraid of, coming to the second thing Israel brings to the table and bringing this back on point, is Iran. Iran is a revolutionary, interventionist, destructive terrorist power at present. They didn't used to be under the Shah, but they are now. And until that government as I was speaking about earlier, will follow. As the other legacy of Trump, besides this deal, is going to be the fall of the Iranian government through the withdrawal from the incredibly stupid Iranian deal that Joe Biden and Barack Obama made. And they're bringing them to their knees. Eventually, that government will fall. But in the meantime, to protect the rest of the Arab world and to form a bloc of free countries, to one degree or another, depending on the government of the countries, and I understand, the enemy of good is perfect. There's no perfect scenario here. So let's not pick apart the Saudi government versus the Israeli government. But it's a marriage not just of convenience, but mutual defense. Israel has by far the most powerful army in the Middle East, one of the most powerful armies in the world. They are a nuclear power. They never talk about it. The joke goes on in Israel. Those of you who know any Israelis, is the day they've never tested an atomic weapon, although certainly they have them, because the Israelis believe that if they test an atomic weapon, it'll be over Tehran. Okay, I mean, they've got them. So Israel does not want a hostile state like Iran getting nuclear weapons. Neither do the Saudis, neither do the Emirates, neither do the Bahrainis. And together, their combined economic might and their combined military might makes it very unlikely that, and has turned the tide on terrorism and the Iranians. And that is the most lasting contribution of Donald Trump. Because everybody, and I mean everybody, in the American conventional foreign policy establishment said that he was out of his fucking mind not to include the Palestinians. They missed it. The Arabs are sick of the goddamn Palestinians. They're sick of the whining and the victimhood. Victimhood is just another word for manipulation, whether it's the Palestinians in the Middle East or Black Lives Matter activists in the United States pining for reparations. It's all manipulation. And people are tired of it. And they're not going to have any more of it. And Donald Trump's peace plan, which when it came out was laughed at by the New York Times, laughed at by the Washington Post, snidely derided by everybody, turned out to be right. And here we are. So now that with Sudan, that'll be 5 Arab countries. With Tunisia, actually, who has regular relationships, that'll be 6. And 50% of them, okay, in other words, UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan have all happened in the last few months. Okay, so the first two, Jordan and Israel and Egypt, come about in the 1970s, then nothing for 40 years, and then Donald Trump comes and bingo, bango, boingo, the entire Middle East situation has changed. This is the most lasting effect of the Trump presidency. This is the thing that will, if he's going to be ever down the road appreciated as better than he was by his peers, this will be the issue that does it. This is greatness. This is what a great plan looks like. It's not perfect. And that's what critics always do. Well, they left out the Palestinians. Well, they left themselves out. They had chance after chance after chance after chance. They said no to Jimmy Carter. They said no to Bill Clinton. They said no to George Bush. They said no, because they were getting paid off. And there was no incentive for them to make the deal. Now, perhaps the Palestinians will get real, because ultimately these old crooks like Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PLO, and the criminals that run Hamas are going to die off. And hopefully the Palestinian people will throw off their government and join in when they see the benefits. When you see Israelis and Emiratis flying back and forth between each other's countries, and Bahrainis and Sudanis, and spreading wealth and progress and better family life and better everything for the average Arab on the street, suddenly the Palestinians, it's going to be either join in or you're fucked. And that is the accomplishment of Donald Trump. And that is why, regardless of how you vote in this election, and I've said over and over again that I'm going to vote for Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian, this was a great accomplishment. You have to give credit where credit is due. And knocking somebody because you're not going to vote for them, or they're of a different party, or there's something about them you don't like. Look, people are complicated. Even Donald Trump is capable of great things. Yes, he's done some vile shit. Just some vile shit. But this is an act of greatness. It's an act of greatness that Barack Obama didn't do, George Bush II didn't do, Bill Clinton didn't do, George Bush I didn't do, even Ronald Reagan couldn't do, okay? There's been no movement in the Middle East since Jimmy Carter, and look how much, and so fast, in such a different way. And this is when people say he should listen to the experts. An expert is a self-proclaimed thing. Who's an expert? An expert is anybody who says they're an expert, who went to school long enough to say they're an expert, to get a degree in a certain field that makes them an expert. But what does a degree prove except that you can regurgitate the answers your professors want you to regurgitate on command? Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have sound reasoning. Okay, you know, an A doesn't mean that you understand any reason why you got that A other than you're great at regurgitating the answers. Consequently, it's okay to buck the establishment if your gut tells you you're right, especially when it turns out as beautifully as this has for Donald Trump. So, to sum it up, good for you, Donald Trump, because Middle East peace is assured, which is a removal of a giant sword of Damocles hanging over the head of all of us. If, for example, Iran had become a nuclear power, which hopefully, when Joe Biden wins this election, which I still think he will, and I don't see any reason that that's not going to happen. Let's hope that he doesn't dement out of this and fuck it all up and go back to the old way of doing things, and finds the momentum of what's going on so irresistible that we stay with the program. And I believe he will. I believe that while he may be corrupt, he is corrupt and everything else and demented, I don't think he's completely stupid. I hope. And besides, you know, it's not like the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis. And I bring the Saudis into this, by the way, even though they haven't normalized, because I assure you that the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan would not have made this deal without Saudis saying okay, because they're their main financial backer and they're the most powerful Sunni Arab country in almost any sense of the measure. And they'll ultimately join too once the king dies. The only reason the Saudis haven't joined in is because the king, who's an 85 plus year old sick man who's going to die soon, will be replaced by the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS or whatever they call him. And anyway, to make a long story short, he'll normalize relationships once the king's dead. He can't do it while his dad's alive, but his dad will, of course, die soon. I mean, that's just a fact. That it's just, you know, I saw on Facebook this morning, there was a little thing that said, how old will you be in 2050? Well, I'll be 93 or dead. And the chances are pretty good I'll be dead. And that's just a recognition of humanity. And so the king is going to die and the prince is going to take over. And yet I know, and he was certainly behind the killing Khashoggi and everything else. And I'm not making apologies for him, but I'm telling you that evil people can do great things. Okay, they can. History has got gajillions of, if we grade great accomplishments, as I pointed out with Lincoln, he was not a great person. He did not think black people were equal. He did not want them in the United States. He wanted to deport them. You know, he caused the Civil War that did not need to be fought. You know, the Union was set up from the beginning. Jefferson said it over and over, as a voluntary institution. So, you know, you got to look at, but evil people can do other great things, okay, like the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery ultimately, which could have happened anyway. I mean, imagine this, if the South had seceded, the North would have certainly had no slaves to begin with. It would have been a slave-free state. In the South, economically, slaves are expensive. Slavery would have ended because slavery is an expensive, inefficient way to do business. But that's another discussion for another day, not to mention it's immoral and inhuman. I mean, that goes without saying. That's an accepted. But the reason that it phased out of England and Spain previously was because it was an incredibly stupid way to do business. And it's much better. If you take a worker out in a field and you give him a plot of land and say it's yours and you have to give me a cut, that's called sharecropping. But you know, it's his land. He works much harder and produces much more crops, as opposed to a slave, which does as much as he has to, but lives in resentment. Just think about it. And you got to clothe them, house them, feed them, you know, medical care, all this other good stuff. You don't throw them back in the shack and wait for them to die. That's not the reality of slavery in the South at the time at all. You know, like any capital asset, the Southern slave owners viewed their slaves as a capital asset. The vast majority took care of them, because if you didn't, they wouldn't produce. But they produce a lot better as free people, right? Everybody does as free people. Consequently, slavery was on its way out. Would have died anyway. Okay, and think of the world wars and the disaster since, and history would have been different. But that's another discussion for another day, and I'm not going to go there because, well, this would turn into hours and hours of me rattling on. And as you can tell with my free-floating digression, I could go almost anywhere. Anyway, let's just recap and let's wrap it up. Donald Trump, Middle East, great accomplishment, all time, puts him on the small group, the short list of presidents who did things that will last essentially forever, certainly for our lifetimes and substantially beyond. Just a great accomplishment. Credit where credit is due. Okay, now, before we go away, let me remind you a couple of things. First of all, I wrote this great political thriller. It's called The Grand Master, okay? I want you guys to pick up your copy of The Grandmaster. Look, you either can get it in paperback or download it or borrow it from the Kindle lending library on Amazon. We'll put the link below, and the picture's probably just appeared beside my head. You know, if it hasn't, Mr. Producer, please put it up. But anyway, big deal. It's a great book, okay? And it's a 21st century redux with a modernization of the central theme away from railroads and into drug dealing of Atlas Shrugged. You know, that was my motivation in writing the book. I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll love it. I think those of you who are free thinkers will think it's not only entertaining and engrossing, but interesting politically, okay? And it's a political intrigue novel of a drug dealer, the Grandmaster, who plots to overthrow the government of the United States. And his motivations, his reasons, his techniques, and how it happens makes for a gripping and interesting story that I know that you will love. Please pick up your copy of The Grandmaster, which also helps support this podcast and makes me a very happy guy. Once again, to remind you, please click on the subscriber button, the notification button, and share this with your friends. Again, text me at Antipolitism at 935-0444. And that's it. Until next time, I want to thank you. By the way, I should always say thank you at the end. I don't know, my mind just surfs. Thank you very, very much for joining me. I hope you found this enlightening and a little different way of looking at things. Soon this national travesty of election will be over and we can breathe easy and talk about other interesting things as well. And until next time, and until our next very interesting conversation, this is E.H. Ivins signing off.